It wasn't a scream. It wasn't an attack. It was silence. In Highgate, North London, people began to realize something was wrong when animals stopped turning up dead and started turning up drained. No clear signs of violence, no struggle, no mess, just dry bodies, strangely preserved, as if something had taken exactly what it needed. At first, nobody called the police, because ridiculed fear is worse than real fear. Who would say aloud that they thought they were seeing something that shouldn't exist? So the stories circulated quietly, in pubs, at bus stops, in quick whispers. Always the same vague description: a tall, dark figure, too still to be human. Highgate Cemetery didn't help. An old Gothic cemetery, partly abandoned, full of broken tombs, open mausoleums, and paths swallowed by vegetation. During the day it seemed merely sad. At night it seemed watchful. Residents said they felt they were being watched, not chased, watched, as if someone were waiting. The first witnesses were discredited because they didn't know each other. Different people, different neighborhoods, different times, but they described the same thing. A figure standing between the trees, eyes that didn't reflect light like human eyes, a strange cold that didn't match the weather. This proves nothing, but mass coincidences always bother experienced investigators. When the sensationalist newspapers caught a whiff of the story, everything spiraled out of control. Headlines spoke of vampires, curses, occult cults. The police were forced to act, not because they believed in something supernatural, but because the collective panic was already greater than any proof. And when fear becomes behavior, it becomes a police case. This is where you need to understand something important. The police didn't enter Highgate looking for a vampire. They entered looking for a rational explanation for something that wasn't behaving rationally. And this type of search is the most dangerous of all, because it starts at a disadvantage. Even before the first patrol crossed the cemetery gates at night, a question was already in the air, even if no one dared to say it clearly. What if the problem wasn't believing too much, but believing too little? The first patrol entered Highgate at night, without sirens, without fanfare, without journalists. 2 police officers, dim flashlights, crackling radio, treading on ground that no one had truly patrolled for years. The cemetery wasn't made for surveillance, it was made for permanence, and that changes everything when you walk through it in the dark. In the first few minutes they found something that shouldn't be there: violated coffins, but not looted. Nothing was missing. No jewelry, no valuables, only displaced lids, old wood carefully forced, not hastily. This disproved the initial hypothesis of juvenile vandalism. Vandals destroy. Here someone was searching. Internal police records described the difficulty of classifying what they were seeing. There were no clear signs of ritual, but there was also no common criminal logic. Some remains bore strange marks, small perforations that didn't correspond to known tools. This didn't make headlines. It remained buried in bureaucratic reports, where uncomfortable things usually die. Meanwhile, outside the cemetery, the reports continued. People swore they saw a figure effortlessly passing through high walls. Others said they heard something moving among the crypts, too heavy to be an animal, too light to be human. The police began to realize that the problem wasn't just what was happening in Highgate, but what Highgate was doing to the people. To contain the panic, the officers adopted the classic strategy: publicly downplay, silently investigate. They denied any unusual element while increasing the frequency of patrols, but this only fueled more rumors. When the authority says there's nothing here and then doubles the police presence, the public understands the message. The mistake was underestimating the psychological effect of the place. Abandoned cemeteries carry history, but Highgate carried something heavier: institutional abandonment. For years, no one cared, no one watched, no one explained. When something strange starts there, it grows quickly because no one trusts anyone. And it was in this vacuum that the story escaped the control of the police. Because while the investigators were trying to fit everything into formal reports, the population had already given a name to the fear. And when a fear receives a name, it takes on a life of its own. The problem was never just what happened in Highgate. The problem was the moment the press realized that fear sells more than facts. Newspapers began competing to see who had the most terrifying story, the most disturbed witness, the most impossible-to-ignore headline. Highgate vampire ceased to be a rumor and became a brand. TV programs began interviewing ordinary residents as if they were experts. People who had never entered the cemetery began to remember strange experiences. Collective memory was contaminated. When you repeat a scary story enough times, the brain begins to fill in the gaps on its own. This is basic psychology, and almost no one at the time took it seriously. The police, under pressure, fell into a classic trap. They tried to control the narrative instead of controlling the facts. Instead of quietly deepening the investigation, they began to react to public opinion. This changes priorities. What seems scary becomes urgent, what is technically important becomes secondary, and thus control of the case is lost. It was in this scenario that the self-proclaimed experts emerged: occultists, vampire hunters, authors of cheap books. Some truly believed what they said, others only saw an opportunity. All, without exception, hindered the investigation, because each amateur nighttime incursion destroyed traces, contaminated scenes, and created new accounts impossible to verify. Police reports from the time mention increasing difficulties in distinguishing fact from staging. Flashlights seen from a distance became glowing eyes. Shadows projected by cameras became human figures. One investigator wrote something revealing. Highgate isn't hiding something. People are projecting something onto it. This says much more about the case than any headline. The police even considered closing the cemetery entirely at night, but they backed down. Closing it would be seen as confirmation that something was being hidden. Not closing it seemed like weakness. This type of dilemma doesn't appear in manuals. It's the kind of decision where any choice worsens the situation. And meanwhile, the most important question remained forgotten. Who was violating the graves and why? Because even if vampires don't exist, crimes do. And when everyone focuses on the supernatural, the human element goes unnoticed. From that point on, the investigation was no longer just about what was happening in Highgate, but about how the police seemed incapable of preventing fear from becoming a public joke. Newspaper cartoons showed police officers hunting vampires with stakes. Ironic comments began to emerge. And this is lethal for any serious investigation, because when authority becomes a laughingstock, it begins to act out of pride, not method. Internally, there was tension. Some officers treated everything as mass hysteria amplified by the media. Others weren't so comfortable. Because away from the cameras, they saw the reports. Violated coffins kept the peering. Ancient tombs continued to be disturbed. Someone was regularly entering there at night. This wasn't imaginary. The strategic error was allowing controlled incursions by civilians accompanied by the press. The idea was to show that there was nothing to hide. The effect was the opposite. Flashlights, cameras, nervous people walking in groups inside a dark cemetery created exactly the kind of images that fuel panic. Shadows became entities. Any noise became evidence. Worse still, these entries destroyed any real chance of preserving the scene. Footprints were erased, objects were moved. The line between investigation and spectacle was blurred. The police, without realizing it, had lost their monopoly on factual truth. And when that happens, the case ceases to be technical and becomes folklore. It was at this moment that reports of direct confrontations emerged. People swore they had seen the figure react to human presence. Stories of chases, falls, fainting spells. None of this was verifiable, but it no longer mattered.
The public didn't want proof, they wanted emotion, and emotion was winning over reason. Within the corporation, a conclusion began to form, even if no one said it aloud. Even if there were a simple explanation, it would no longer be accepted. The case had passed the point of no return. Any rational answer would seem too weak in the face of the constructed narrative. And this is where the police make their second major mistake. Instead of quietly closing the investigation and focusing on the real crime, the desecration of the graves, they try to provide a symbolic ending, something to appease the public, something visible, something that would look like action.
At some point, the police ceased to be the primary force in Highgate, not officially, of course, but in practice, those who dictated the pace of the story were people who should never have been near such a scene. Self-proclaimed vampire hunters, weekend occultists, curious individuals armed with stakes, crucifixes, and cheap cameras. What seemed ridiculous was, in fact, dangerous. These nighttime incursions lacked method, control, and real legal responsibility. Graves were opened without any criteria. Human remains were exposed. All this not in the name of investigation, but in the name of a spectacle that needed to be increasingly extreme to continue attracting attention. The police tried to contain it. There were warnings, attempts to disperse the crowds, some isolated arrests, but the damage was already done. Highgate became a stage, and when a place becomes a stage, the truth becomes a mere extra. Any real trace of who originally violated the graves was irretrievably lost in that chaos. And here emerges a disturbing detail that almost no one mentions. Some of these hunters knew exactly where to go, specific graves, specific mausoleums. This raises an unsettling hypothesis. They weren't just reacting to the legend, they were following something someone had already started before the hysteria exploded. While the public laughed or was frightened, real crimes were happening. Desecration of corpses, destruction of historical heritage, possible trafficking of human remains. All of this took a back seat because the vampire narrative was more interesting. The police, under political pressure, chose the wrong enemy to fight. Some more experienced officers began to record something unsettling. After the hunters appeared, reports of the figure almost completely disappeared, not because the fear ended, but because the focus shifted. The myth had served its purpose. It diverted attention from something concrete that no one was investigating anymore. And here's the cruel irony. If someone was using Highgate for something illegal, that person got away scot-free, camouflaged by the noise, protected by ridicule, invisible behind the legend. The vampire may never have existed, but it was the best possible distraction for someone who didn't want to be seen. When the media dust begins to settle, some investigators do what should have been done from the beginning. They go back to the cold records, dates, times, exact locations of the violated graves, and a pattern begins to emerge, discreet but too consistent to be ignored. The violations were not random, they followed a logic. The graves most affected were old, rarely visited, many belonging to extinct families or without living descendants. This matters because it drastically reduces the chance of immediate denunciation. Someone knew the terrain, knew the history of the place, knew where to tamper without drawing attention until the hysteria exploded. Another detail ignored by the public: no recent bodies were violated. This completely dismantles the narrative of an active predator hunting victims. What there was an interest in ancient remains. This points to much more earthly motives: illegal trade, staged rituals, morbid fetishism, or even fraud involving historical relics. There are records that at the time a small clandestine market for bones and funerary artifacts existed in Europe. It wasn't large, but it was lucrative, and places like Highgate, abandoned and poorly guarded, were perfect targets. But this never gained enough attention because it didn't frighten as much as the word vampire. What's most disturbing is realizing how human behavior adapts to chaos. When the myth took hold, those who actually violated the tombs didn't need to flee. They only needed to blend in. Lanterns at night ceased to be suspicious. People walking among tombs became hunters. The perfect disguise is one that seems too absurd to be taken seriously.
Some police officers even suggested, informally, that the figure described at the beginning might just be an ordinary person using fear as a tool, standing still, observing, knowing that being seen didn't mean being pursued, but becoming history. This completely changes the interpretation of the first accounts. And here's where everything connects. The vampire never needed to exist. What existed was a perfect environment for collective error, an abandoned place, a tense population, a hungry media, and someone or some smart enough to use all of this as a smokescreen.
When investigators finally realize that the Highgate vampire has become an irreversible strategic error, the priority shifts. It's no longer about discovering who was violating the graves, it's about containing the institutional damage. Because at that point, any new action would only reinforce the idea that something out of the ordinary really existed there. The formal investigation begins to gradually crumble. There's no announcement of closure, no press conference, no clear official conclusion. The reports simply stop being updated. Cases like this don't die, they're shelved due to wear and tear. It's an old technique, used when solving it costs more than forgetting it. Some younger officers try to persevere. They want to follow the human, rational trail that begins to appear in the records, but they encounter internal resistance. It's not worth it. We can't prove anything anymore. The public has already moved on. And this reveals something harsh. The police are also hostage to public opinion. The cemetery undergoes administrative changes. Nighttime access is more restricted. Fences are reinforced. The practical problem is contained, but no answers are offered about the recent past. No one is to blame, no one is responsible, no public apologies, just an attempt to turn the page without reading it to the end. And the public accepts it, because fear has already served its purpose. Other stories emerge, other panics take its place. Highgate ceases to be news and becomes an urban legend, something for late-night shows, cheap books, and tourist curiosity. This is convenient for everyone, except for the truth. The most unsettling detail is this: no one was ever officially charged with the violations. No relevant arrests, no confessions, no closed chain of events. This doesn't happen because there was no possible answer, but because the path to it became too contaminated to be legally safe. And so, the case is buried in the most British way possible, with politeness, silence, and bureaucracy. There was no vampire, there was no conclusion. Only the uncomfortable feeling that something real went unnoticed while everyone looked at the supernatural. The case of the so-called Highgate vampire never needed fangs to work. It worked because it revealed something far more dangerous than the supernatural. How easy it is to derail a real investigation using fear, spectacle, and collective distraction. While everyone debated whether vampires existed, someone very real walked freely among the tombs, unidentified, uninterrupted. The police never announced a conclusion because any conclusion would be admitting error, admitting they lost control of the narrative, admitting they allowed the media, the curious, and opportunists to destroy a legitimate investigation. And institutions rarely admit this publicly. They prefer to let time erase the questions. Today, when you visit Highgate, the atmosphere is almost touristy. Guides talk about the legend with a half smile. Fear has become folklore. But the detail no one mentions is this: real crimes happened there and were never solved. Human remains were violated, historical heritage was destroyed, and no one paid for it. And here's the question that changes everything. If someone used the myth as the perfect cover once, why wouldn't they use it again somewhere else? How many bizarre, impossible, too ridiculous to be real cases have concealed simple crimes that were never seriously investigated because they seemed too absurd? The Highgate Empire didn't terrorize London because it existed. It terrorized because it was useful. Useful for the media to sell fear. Useful for curious people to feel like protagonists. Useful for criminals to hide. Useful for institutions to shut down something that got out of control without providing answers. So the next time you hear a story that's too supernatural, don't ask if it's true.
Ask what it's hiding. Who benefits from the noise? Who disappears while everyone is looking at the wrong shadow? And that's why this case still bothers experienced investigators to this day. Not because no one has proven that vampires don't exist, but because no one has proven who was there when no one was paying attention. Now I'll throw the question to you, and this is where the comments explode. If you were the police, would you have the courage to admit that the biggest mistake was letting fear tell the story? Comment, because while we laugh at the legends, the mistakes keep repeating themselves.